Well, good morning. Happy 4th of July weekend. I hope you are all enjoying the holiday weekend and this beautiful weather we have outside and spending time with family or friends or on the barbecue or whatever the case may be. Couple of things to go over today is Communion Sunday. So if you want to take that with your family, go ahead and get your elements and spend some time in communion. Our men's group will not be meeting on Monday night this week because it is the 4th of July, so they'll pick it up again next week. Our ladies group will be meeting Thursday night at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let myself or Deanne Paradis know, and we'd love to have you join us. Today's our regular tithe and offering. You know the drill. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, and give a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can give to our missions that way. You can also give to our live streaming that we're trying to raise money for. It's called Stage Remodel if you do it online. So when you do the drop-down button, give to the Stage Remodel, and that will go towards our live streaming to buy new cameras and get that set up for the folks who watch from out of town or on the video, and that way they can experience our worship team too. So we're trying to raise that money. Anything you can give towards it would be greatly appreciated. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119, or if you live in the local area and you'd like Pastor Carl and I to come by and pick it up, we'd be happy to do that too. Again, thank you for your generosity in giving. It's very hard times right now with all the prices of everything going up, but we're able to stay afloat here at the Father's House because of that. So that's all I have to cover today. We'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl and see what he's going to teach us today. Thank you.
Well, good morning, Father's House. How are you? Happy 4th of July weekend to all of you. I bet you're going to have a good time. This Sunday, of course, you can be in church, and maybe you'll barbecue today. Heck, maybe you'll barbecue tomorrow. Hey, maybe you're going to do it all 3 days. Maybe you took off Tuesday or Friday, and you're going to do 4 days. Whatever you're doing, it's going to be a great weekend. The weather here in the Bay Area has been absolutely perfect, about 80 degrees. I don't think you could ask for better than that. You don't have to have your air conditioners on, nothing like that. You can get outdoors without feeling like you're sweltering. So it's kind of a good time, isn't it? Anyway, I'm glad to be here today. I'm glad you're here with me today. We've got some things I want to talk about as we kind of finished up the virtues. And I now want to bring them today all together kind of in a common thought about them. But before I do that, I do want to mention that Penny had mentioned the idea of that we're trying to raise money for the cameras and for the live streaming stuff. I know people are hurting for money, and it's difficult with everything going up so much. But if you could contribute, it would be greatly appreciated. I thought by now we would have raised a substantial amount for it, but we just haven't. So we're going to be delayed. I actually thought that by now we would be around that $2,000 mark, and we're just not there. We're well below the $1,000 mark. So if you can give, if it's something you would want to be a part of, by way of being a part of this and having this be live streamed. And maybe it's something that, maybe what you guys are saying is you really don't want it to be live streamed the whole service. And I understand that if you don't. People that are coming to church on Sunday, they're probably not going to be as motivated to give towards the live streaming of our service because they're here at service, or they can make it to service. So they're just kind of in a different place, and I understand that. And this don't feel compelled, but I just thought we would be further than we were. But it is what it is, so we'll live with it one way or the other, won't we? Anyway, like I said, I want to finish up today. I probably won't be long today, but I wanted to finish up talking about the idea of the virtues that we've talked about. We talked about the 4 cardinal virtues, although, there's many, many other virtues we didn't talk about. So we talked about the idea of courage or fortitude, strength of mind, temperance, self-control, justice, right, which is, giving the other what is due them. Then we talked about prudence or common reasoning, well-reasoning concerning the use of virtues in all of our life because they become a part of our character. And then we talked also about the notion of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And last week we finished with the virtue of religion, which is, in the spiritual sense, it's the same virtue as justice, and that is to give God his due. So we talked a lot about that. If you didn't see that last week, you're probably going to want to go back and watch it because it just gives you a different perspective on why we go to church, why we give, why we honor, and how we honor God, and why those things are important. So if you get a chance to go back and look at that, it would be great. But today I want to kind of tie these things together with a couple of notions. The first notion that I want to talk about is it's the idea that when you're living these virtues, it translates into wisdom, a practical wisdom to some extent, because you find that you're not ensnared in a lot of things in life because you possess these virtues. And you possess these virtues because you practice these virtues by way of habituation, by way of habit. With that being said, I think sometimes what we think when we become a Christian is, well, I just believe Jesus Christ by faith, and then at that point, then God's just going to do it all in me, and I don't have to do anything. But I don't think Scripture points to that, because Scripture always points to us always being involved in developing our character and developing our character traits. So the virtues that we're talking about are those internal traits by which we should view reality, view the world, and view God in a proper way so that we would have what would be called a life well lived. Aristotle called it eudaimonia, which is the idea of a life well lived. So these things all create a balance for us. So our life comes together. And what we find is that we find that we live better because we're not making as many mistakes or answering for as many questions that we've blown it in different things, because we've used practical wisdom to reason about self-control, strength of mind when we're in stressful situations, how we ought to treat others justly, and how also to think reasonably about how we ought to do all of those things. Faith, hope, and love, and again, talking about a relationship with God. So they cause us to live well, which is really true freedom. See, the opposite of a virtue is a vice. So the opposite of somebody that has control of their spirit is somebody who doesn't have control of their spirit. And we see that with people when they have outbursts of anger or addictions or things like that. They're just not controlling their spirit, and so they've got a vice. And so all the virtues, as we practice them, they free the shackles of our vices so that we can have and live in true freedom. And so that becomes very important. Now, today I want to talk about two aspects of that. The first one I want to talk about is from the Apostle Paul talking about our mind and a renewing of our mind. We're going to talk about that. The second one, when we talk about these virtues, and we're talking about really virtue ethics or virtue morality or our moral autonomy of the way we ought to behave. The second thing is that, you see, we carry these things and present these things to God on the other side of this temporal reality that we're in when we stand before God on the judgment day. And he's going to look at us by virtue of these virtues. He's going to be these, and I'm going to explain that because the psalmist, David, actually makes mention of that. So I'm going to talk about two scriptures. The first one is going to come talking about the idea of the renewing of our mind. The first one is these virtues, when we are living in them by habit, then what's happening is we're beginning to change, because we're beginning to change the way we see things, perceive things, and reason about things. So the Apostle Paul, in the book of Romans, as you get through the last part of the book of Romans, chapter 12, after talking about justification and sanctification and glorification and what that all means, we're not going to get into that today, but he there at the end of it all, he says, so this is what I want you to do as Christians, talking about how we live the Christian life. And so he says here, and with our relationship to ourselves and how we should behave and how we should act virtuously. He says, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and a holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you might prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. So there's a couple of things that the Apostle Paul is telling us that he wants us to do in that particular instance. What he's saying that he wants us to do is that we're to present our bodies as a living sacrifice to God. What he's saying about that is that the way that we do that, and as we do that, we become this living sacrifice or this living testimony of God to other people by way of our showing, exhibiting courage when we need to, self-control, love, faith, hope, justice, whatever the case might be. So us as living bodies is whatever our character is for each and every one of us, this is what we carry into the world. These are the things that and how we perceive the world and how we act. So if we don't know how to act in different situations, if we understand what the virtues are, then we begin to relate them and know that that's how we ought to act and begin to act that way. So it changes our character. The Apostle Paul goes on to say, after talking about presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice, he says that you do that by not being conformed to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you might prove what the will of God is, that which is now get it, good, which we talked about eudaimonia, or a life well lived, right? So for a life that is good, and that is well pleasing to the Lord. So there's this idea and this notion where, and perfect. So it's this idea of a life that's good, well pleasing to the Lord, right? And it's a perfection, and that word perfection can really means maturity to some extent. So that when we have our minds transformed by not being conformed to the world, what happens is we can then perceive what the real good is, the ultimate good in the situation. How would that work? Well, let's think about the difference between something that would be good when we're talking about self-control or controlling our spirit, and something that would not be good, or which would be a vice, right? So a virtue being good and a vice being evil. And so virtue and vice to some extent, and talk about that text about being good, that we might know what, the perfect will of God, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. So the first one there, when you talk about the idea of being good, society might say, well, I have the freedom, and it's a good thing to have the freedom, that I can go out and I can drink as much as I want to drink. I have the freedom, because I live in California, to smoke as much pot as I want to smoke. And it's true that people have the freedom to do those things. But what happens is they're misunderstanding what it means when we talk about Christian freedom. And so in the world says, I'm free to do this. I'm free to drink. I'm free to smoke marijuana. Heck, I'm free to smoke cigarettes, chew, whatever the case might be. So, but what happens is they're mistaking the Christian notion of freedom as it gives us license to do everything. Now, you can do that. There's nobody that's going to stop you because you have a free will. But if you spend too much time drinking, you spend too much time doing drugs, what's going to happen? It's likely that you're going to get addicted to those drugs. At that point, that very freedom that you had now becomes a bondage and a vice that you have. So you're no longer really free. Christian freedom and a renewing of the mind, and so that we understand that which is good, acceptable, and perfect, or good, acceptable, and mature, works the opposite way. I'm free, and I can do those things. We're talking about temperance now. So I have a little bit of alcohol in moderation. It's not going to hurt me to have a glass of wine, 2 glasses of wine. But I've got enough control in my spirit to know that I've got to control it, or it will control me. So in one way, I'll either be free and still have this moderate lifestyle. But if I'm not, and I go the other way, then what's going to happen is I'm going to end up in this vice, which is not good, which is kind of an evil. On the other side, to understand what is good, if I'm living by the virtue by the virtue of temperance, self-control, and I'm controlling those things, I'm free, and that's true Christian freedom, because I'm not bound and shackled by those things. So Christian freedom always works for us to be free from the bondages of sin, free from the shackles of addiction. It could be anger. It can be the love of money. It can be greed. It can be fame, honor, praise, all of those things. And so those are the things that might not, or those things could be of the flesh, but the virtues point us towards, and they begin to bring us into this Christian maturity of where we're free from those things in our very character reference so that we behave properly in all situations. Now, I realize that I probably just said a mouthful, didn't I? But I hope that you kind of understand what we're talking about when we talk about this idea of Christian freedom. In the world, if you conform to the world, they say, I'm free, and so I can do what I want. And the Christian notion of freedom is, I'm free, but because I've developed the virtues within me, I know that those addictions and those kind of excess living situations are not true freedom at all. Therefore, by the renewing of my mind, I understand the place of courage, strength of mind, temperance, control of your own spirit, or self-control, and the other virtues. So I'm free to operate in those, and I'm no longer entangled in those things that are of the system of the world or the way they perceive freedom. So it's not being conformed to the world, but transformed by the renewing of your mind. When we understand what the virtues are, and we let them transform us because we apply them in every situation that we can, being consciously aware of it, then we find our mind transferred. Eventually, it's no longer difficult or hard to do it. Let me give you an example. Remember when you were in, I don't know when you learned the times tables in school anymore. I want to say that we were learning the times tables in the second or the third grade when I was in grade school. And maybe fourth, I don't know, maybe it's fourth. But anyway, remember when you started working on the times table and 2 times 2 is 4 and 2 times 3 is 6. And remember how when you first started to learn those things, they were very difficult concepts and ideas for you to learn as you were committing them by habit to memory. But if you think about it now that you're an adult, if somebody asks you what 7 times 7 is, you have absolutely no hard time, well, hopefully, recalling exactly what 7 times 7 is, do you? And it's because it became easier because through time and applying the habit of learning those, it now comes to you naturally to understand that 7 times 7 is 13. Oh, I guess it's not, but it is 49. So the idea about that, though, is all of a sudden now you react to those things because they're a part of you. It's in your mind. The same way that it works when we were learning the times tables, learning another language, learning different ideas and concepts. Maybe it has to do with accounting or what has to do with computer stuff. Eventually, what seems to be hard becomes a natural, intuitive motion on our behalf. The virtues are that same way. When we start looking at situations when we should apply justice, what happens is that it might be hard at the beginning to decipher those things, or courage. But eventually what begins to happen is, because we've mastered them and practiced those things, what happens is they just flow out of us naturally, the same way that we know what 7 times 7 is. It's interesting when you think about that, because what it is then we become somewhat, there's by the grace of God, and I would never leave God out of the equation, but what happens is we begin to master ourselves. We begin to have self-mastery over the way we do things, so we're no longer overridden by our emotions. Think about it with Cain and Abel. When Cain slew Abel, before he did that, God appeared to him and says, Cain, I know what you want to do. You want to kill your brother Abel because you're jealous and mad. And he said, I want to tell you something, Cain. Don't do it. For sin is crouching at the door, and you must master it. So we've got to master those things that can become our addictions. And that comes by the way of the virtues. Be not conformed to the world, but transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. Okay. So with that in line and understanding that we can do that and apply ourselves, and it's our Christian responsibility to apply that to ourselves, what happens is then we grow in practical wisdom, don't we? We become wise in discerning things. We become wise in making value judgments about circumstances, places, or things that are going on. conversations that we're having with people, because all of these virtues lead to a wise spirit and a wise man or a wise woman, a sage, if you would have. But the idea is that, you see, we're held accountable, and we're going to present ourselves before God. And when we present ourselves before God, we're going to give an account of God as to how well we've done with the virtues. Not about how well we've done in business or how well we've done as out and, I don't know, leading people to Jesus or teaching in a Sunday school or being pastors and how big our churches are. Those aren't the things that I think we're judged on. What we're going to be judged on is our character traits. And I'm not saying that, and I don't want to make the judgment when we stand before God. I don't want to make it a negative thing, because what we're going to see in this text I'm going to read out of the book of Psalms is actually, or it can be, a positive thing, because we're going to stand before God and he's going to examine us. Almost in the way that when a young man or a young woman comes out of boot camp and they're ready to graduate out of boot camp and they're in their graduation, that what happens is all of those that are standing in the boot camp, they go through this procession and they're standing there. And what's happening is the commander is examining these that came out of boot camp to see if they're soldier ready, if they're ready to graduate, to go on to the next level in their training. In the same way that there's the boot camp with young Marines, Army, Navy, and Air Force, so they're presented ready to move on forward. In some cases, the virtues, and when we possess the virtues, means that we're ready to graduate and move on to the next thing and to the next things that God has for us by way of our training. Now, that happens on the other side in most cases, I would think, if not all cases of our life, on the other side of death. But here's what the psalmist says about this idea of wisdom, which when we begin to understand the boot camp of the virtues and we're ready to graduate, this is what the psalmist says about that condition. It's Psalm 90, and you guys have heard most of this passage, but in some cases, I'm not sure that we understand that this last little phrase and the ramifications of what it is that I want to say. So in Psalm 90, in verse 10, it says, as for the days of our lives, they contain 70 years. Or, if due to strength, 80 years. Yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone, and we fly away. I mean, we pass, right? Who understands the power of your anger, and your fury according to the fear that is due you? I'm sorry, let me read that again. Who understands the power of your anger, and the fury according to the fear that is due you? That word fear really means respect or honor. So teach us to number our days. Teach us to number our days. And this is what he says. So that on the other side, when we're there, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. So what he's saying, that as we number our days on earth here, which means we make the most out of our days, that we work on our character all of our days, knowing that we have 70 or 80, maybe 90, maybe even 100. My mom is getting ready this next week to turn to be 99 years old. But our days are still numbered. So when we number our days and we make the most of them to change ourselves, to become better Christians, better people, better citizens of society, when we focus on wisdom and pursuing the wisdom, the things that God wants us to pursue, the wisdom that comes from God, then we pass from this life after 70, 80, 90 years, maybe even into the hundreds. What we can do is, standing before God, we can present to him a soldier-ready Christian that has been trained by a virtuous life and by working on the virtues all of their lives, simply because they understood the definition of what the virtues mean. They start to begin to apply them to their life by not conforming to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of their mind. So that at the end of their life, after a lifelong endeavor, never really being perfect in that way, but being mature, we present before God a heart full of wisdom. I don't know about you, but I think that's something that is worthy of our pursuit, of becoming people that pursue the things of God, the character of God, the character traits that are there in God, God's idea and notion of courage, of justice, temperance, of prudence, faith, hope, and love, and religion. When we do those things, and we concentrate our very core of our being on those things, we'll be changed into the image of his Son. And it's there in pursuing those things that we find wisdom as she welcomes us. So that when we pass and we stand before God, we won't be there empty-handed. And by his grace and mercy and him working with us in those endeavors, we'll stand before him and present a heart full of wisdom. Today, the only thing I can ask you is, will you say yes to this? Will you choose to live a life like this? We're never going to be perfect. That's not the issue. A soldier that comes out of boot camp isn't necessarily completely combat ready because he's got other things to learn, other things to grow in, other ways to mature. But he's presented as being worthy to make it to the next move, the next level. And so for us, the virtues are a passageway into wisdom, to understanding wisdom, conveying wisdom to others, and presenting it before God. I hope you'll think about it. I hope you'll think deeply about it. I challenge myself to think deeply about these things and to change myself. Maybe one day I'll be able to stand there and present these things to God and not stand before him empty-handed. I hope you'll make the same commitment. God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week.